Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Project Procurement Management Overview. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In part 1, we started the overview of Project Procurement Management, and now we're going to continue with that. We'll then do a review, go through sample exam questions, and conclude with a look ahead to future lessons here in this particular knowledge area. The next question we want to answer is, from whom are you going to buy your product, service or result? We call this the source. And there are 3 main types of market conditions as it pertains to sellers or sources that you need to be aware of. There is the sole source. That refers to a market condition in which only one qualified seller exists for a specific product. Then we have the single source. This refers to a market condition in which the company prefers to contract with only one seller. This is also called a preferred seller. There is also a third one called the oligopoly. And no, this has nothing to do with the board game, Monopoly. Monopoly would in fact be another name for the sole source market condition, listed at the very top, where there's only one qualified seller that exists in the market. The oligopoly, on the other hand, refers to a market condition where a very few number of sellers exist, such as the action of one seller will have impact on other sellers, particularly on the price. For instance, if there are only 2 sellers of a particular product on the market, and one of them decides to slash their price by 25%, well, then the other one really has to lower their price as well if they want to be able to continue to sell their product. In part 1, we learned that procurements can range from simple to complex. Let's refine this a little bit. We differentiate 3 categories of procurement. First of all, we have the major complexity procurements, also known as high-risk procurements. Here the intention is to buy something that does not yet exist. This can happen if you're working on a project that goes into new territory. You may need to procure an item that has yet to be created and developed. Someone first needs to produce that item for you. Procuring an item like that is usually done as a separate sub-project. Second, then we have the minor complexity procurements, also known as low-risk procurements. These are items that exist, but they are expensive. You'll be able to find them exactly to the specifications that you need, but it's going to cost you a pretty penny. Something that can happen with these minor complexity procurements is that you turn them into a major complexity procurement. Let's assume that you are buying a specialized machine that is powered by electricity, but you need it to be powered by natural gas. That is going to be a major design change and will instantly move this procurement from low risk to high risk. And then the third category of procurements are routine purchases. These are known as commercial off-the-shelf products, or COTS. This would be things like office furniture, office supplies, or anything else really that you may need for your project that can easily be procured from many vendors without much evaluation. Very likely your company uses an external service that shows up in the evenings and they clean your office, right? This would also be considered as COTS because it's so readily available. If you think of your procurement needs, you will see that they can be classified into 2 types, and they are, of course, goods and services. Goods are tangible, let's say 50,000 glass bottles. Services are more intangible products, like setting up a computer network, as an example of a technical service. Obviously, you need to buy goods and services either as part of the project that you are managing or as part of the product that you will be delivering at the end of your project. As part of your product, for example, you're going to procure 50,000 of these glass bottles so that you can then, towards the end of the project, fill them with that great wine that your project is going to produce. And as part of your project, you're going to procure the services of a technician to set up your computer network so that your software developers can then use that computer network and deliver the product of your project, which would be computer software code. Let's take a look at a contractual situation, and let's take a look at this from the point of view of the buyer for a second. So let's say you are purchasing new buses for the public transport system in your town from a particular seller. You expect this seller, of course, to deliver these new buses to you. But apart from the physical objects, the buses themselves, you expect the seller to train your staff in driving them, train the mechanics, and install maintenance equipment. And of course, you also want the seller to deliver these buses on time to you. So you see, you're not just buying buses from the seller. Essentially, we are saying that you are procuring a complete bus project from your seller. So if you are procuring a complete bus project, what does this imply? Of course, it means that the seller will be managing this contract with you to sell you the buses as a bus project on their end. You are therefore not just the buyer of these buses, you now become a major stakeholder in this project. Well then, what does this have to do with procurement? Well, take a look at this from the bigger picture. The seller from whom you have purchased these buses will be setting up a project team, and that team will be working on all the project processes, not just on procurement management. And the terms and conditions of the contract that the two of you have signed, those will serve them as inputs to the processes within the seller's project. The delivery date, for instance, will be a constraint in project time management on their project. So to you, the buyer, this is plain procurement, but to the seller, this becomes a project. And so we suddenly have two project managers. The project manager who's buying the buses and the project manager who is building, constructing and delivering these buses. The project manager on the buyer side acts as the stakeholder with purely his or her buyer hat on. They should follow all the processes relating to the project procurement management knowledge area. The project manager on the seller side manages the project and uses the processes from all project management areas that are involved in what he or she is selling to you. In our case here, buses. Whichever your particular role might be on a project, the important thing is to understand and respect the other party's perspective, interest and responsibilities. But let's be clear. Here on the Prepcast and also for the PMP exam, when we consider the buyer-seller relationship, we mean that someone on our project buys and someone from outside our project sells it to us. In this regard, there are two interesting relationships that are important to note at this point, namely the strategic teaming agreements between two or more companies and interdivisional work, and they are both part of procurement management. So first of all, the strategic teaming agreements between two companies. They are often used at a very senior executive level. So for instance, the CEO level. To get things done that are strategic, risky, and cost a lot. In this regard, your CEO or CEO of one or two or three companies, they agreed that they will enter into an agreement and partner together and work on all parts of this new product and service that you are developing. The cost and the revenue of doing this project, they are then later on shared. And then we also have the interdivisional work, which we all have likely experienced, or given the negative aspects of the arrangements, some might even say that we have suffered through interdivisional work. The question really is, Why is it that it seems more complicated to just work with another department in my own company than it is with an outside vendor? Well, the answer is that politics and the strategic alignment of the projects are usually the issues in play in an interdivisional work arrangement. For example, most often an internal project does not hold the same high regard as an external project would. Additionally, since we are both working for the same company anyway, we don't need a contract for this, right? Well, wrong. Let's see how we should handle internal interdivisional projects. For project procurement management, we normally assume that a type of formal contract exists between the buyer and the seller. But most of what we talk about really here is also valid if there is no formal agreement, and also for interdivisional work. So if the buyer is the accounting department of our company and the seller is the IT department of our company, and because we know that this kind of interdivisional work is so much more difficult to manage than a real buyer-seller relationship with a third company from outside delivering to us, that is the reason why we should still aim for a formal contract. Don't assume that you don't really need one. As I just said, you will set yourself up for failure. And if you assume that there is no need to have a formal contract because you all work for the same organization, well, there's a wall waiting for you that you'll run into. Please remember that this is where your experience may vary from what you are expected to know for the PMP exam. Every company has different procedures, but in a perfect world, and the PMP exam assumes a perfect world, you will have a formal contract between the buyer and the seller, even if they are two internal departments. Okay, we all realize that there are non-contractual agreements, just handshake, for example, but understand and know that procurement management, its processes and principles also apply to a simple handshake, to a simple non-contractual agreement. Here are some more considerations for procurement management. Just as in other knowledge areas, you as the project manager, you want to get on board and be involved early in the process. You also want to involve the right people along the way, as dictated by your organizational rules, policies, and procedures, not including the right people at the right time and following the rules of procurement. That may prove to be just disastrous. With so many procurement requirements, you need to focus your time and efforts on where it counts the most. So consider using the 80-20 rule. To start, focus on the procurement which cost the most and are most risky. For example, labor usually is an area where many project managers pay a lot of attention to, precisely for those reasons. It may be difficult to recruit people with the right skills, expertise, and experience. Human resources is so critical to most projects. For example, in the movie industry, if you are not able to secure the lead actors, the film project would not get very far. We have already learned that we need to go through all procurement processes for each and every item that needs to be procured. But what are those procurement steps and processes? Well, let's go through each of the processes and highlight the types of activities that need to be accomplished for each one. First is planning. In procurement management, when we plan, we do the following. We identify needs, or we figure out what products, equipment, and or services are required for the project. Then we document purchasing decisions and procurement approaches. This is where we conduct the make or buy analysis and determine what the appropriate contract type is that we should use. We identify and evaluate potential sellers and how much time and effort we are going to spend on planning procurements is tied to the cost and time available to deliver the project. After planning, we conduct or execute the procurement, we do the following. We contact and obtain responses from sellers, and based on established selection criteria, we compare the responses to make a vendor selection. There may be further interactions and negotiation involved, but eventually both seller and vendor agree, and the contract is awarded to the selected vendor. After we contracted it out, we have to control procurements, and by that we have to manage the procurement relationships, mainly to ensure that buyer and seller are performing as agreed. We have to monitor contract performance and any contract change control. There may be established conditions of performance. For example, we need to ensure that the other party is not in breach of service level agreements, SLAs. There may be reasons that terms in the contract need to be removed, modified or added, and you also want to ensure that everyone has adhered to the procurement policies. And finally, as we close procurements, we complete the procurement, and by this we mean that we finalize any open claims. These could mean figuring out what goods and services have yet to be received. Perhaps you had to return some damaged merchandise and are expecting to be refunded a certain amount. We update and archive records and documents. Organizational policy may dictate that records have to be kept for a certain time. For example, if you work for an airline to fulfill FAA requirements, it's required that you have full record of procurement of any airplane parts and maintenance. Once you obtain formal acceptance of the product, service or result, you need to ensure proper payment to fulfill the buyer's side obligation of the contract. So those were quite a number of steps, and earlier on in the lesson we learned that we have to go through these steps for each and every item that we want to procure. Right, let me give you an example that will really drive home the concept of the repetitiveness of these procurement management activities. And for this, let's assume that you want to buy a car and a boat, and we'll start with the car. You plan this purchase, and at some point you're going to select the brand and the type of car that you want. So you go out and you find a dealership and you test drive the car, and you go home, you think about it overnight, and maybe at some point you go back to the dealership and you sign the contract to buy the car, and you pay for the car, and you drive the car off the lot, and at this point you own the car. After that, you drive over to the boat dealership, and then you just go and buy the first boat that the dealer shows you and you pay for it, right? Or would you much rather go through the processes again, very methodically, and just buy a boat with the same care as you just have done for the car? Well, I thought so. Although we did not use all the formal steps in the procurement management lifecycle in this example, we wanted to illustrate how in your own personal procurement it's prudent to go through the process. On a project, it's important to methodically go through the procurement processes for each item to be procured. Let's review. For the purpose of the PMP exam, when we consider the buyer-seller relationship, we assume the perspective of the buyer. We buy something from somebody outside of our project. In any procurement, whether it's interdivisional or not, aim for a formal contract. It helps to ensure that the buyer and seller are holding up to their side of the agreement. Organizational policies designate the appropriate signing authority for procurement contracts. The policies, along with the organizational structure, define whether or not procurement and contracting occur centrally at the organizational level or more locally at the project level. Both buyer and seller are effectively project managers. Buyers focus on the procurement management processes. The seller has to use, on the other hand, project management processes from all knowledge groups to deliver the product, service, or result to the buyer, who is his customer. No matter which hat you are wearing, it's important to be aware and respect the other side's perspective and interest. As a project manager, you should get involved early and involve the right people in the procurement management process at the appropriate times according to the procurement policies and regulations of your organization. The processes of planning, conducting, controlling, and closing procurements need to be repeated methodically for each item to be procured. So what type of questions do we see for procurement management in the commercially available sample tests online or in books? Well, a common question is set up as a scenario and based on the fact that a contract does not have to be in writing. Instead, a simple agreement, a verbal agreement, a handshake, or an email already constitutes a contract that you can fall back on in purchasing. Another favorite in terms of sample questions relates to the idea that you only have to deliver what's included in the contract. If something was first agreed upon but then not included in the final signed contract, even if it was an oversight, then it's not part of what needs to be delivered. You can also expect questions that you are given a scenario or a situation and you have to decide which contract type would work best. Of course, we will learn more about these contract types in a later lesson here. And finally, another common question has to do with the understanding of the difference between close procurements and the close project or phase process. And this concludes our overview of project procurement management. In the lessons that are to follow on procurement processes, we're going to be looking at the types of contracts that we know, like fixed priced or time and material contracts. We're also going to be looking at what a bidder conference is. We will discuss the various selection criteria that are available to you to choose the right contract type, of course. And yes, we will discuss the difference between closing a contract and closing a project or a phase. And with that, we have come to the end of this lesson. So, Justine, what's your farewell this time?
Aloha.
And of course, I stick to my tried and trusted. Until next time.